Well, if you're thinking about just what the brain can do, I like using just crazy, gnarly examples. I used to work in an Alzheimer's clinic when I was trying to get into medical school. And once in a while, these older folks, they would have dementia. Parts of the brains would literally wither, like the flesh would wither. It's not just the thinking and the electricity.
Right.
And hidden painting abilities would come out. So you see, and I'm not talking like they're going to be in a museum at some point, but a dramatic change in the way they wrote, in their ability to paint landscapes. And in neurosurgery, sometimes we do place catheters into the emotional hubs inside our brain. So the thinking brain's like a mushroom cap.
To what end?
You can electrically break an obsessive compulsive disorder habit. The way I think habits function, these are my ideas, is that because it's such an energy hog, it wants to be efficient. So this whole myth about you only use 20% of your brain, no, we use 100% of our brain, and pictures show that. But to get things done, we might only use 15. To get something complicated done, we might only use 35. Otherwise, otherwise you wouldn't be an efficient animal or a human in the savannah if you couldn't really control this important, but not having it in fifth gear all the time is an evolutionary strategy, in my opinion. So I explained to my kids, okay, so then it falls into ruts, because efficiency is about ruts, like dominoes falling in a certain path. And the best way I can explain it is, as you grow, the brain, the way the electricity flows, the way the connections prioritize, is a bit like skiing down a mountain. It starts creating these electrical grooves of sort, where if you see something, you see a cliff, fear, it goes down a certain path. And every time you do that and you've reinforced it, it actually becomes less expensive energy-wise to follow and fall into that habit. So these pathways, these habits in our mind, these rituals, these things that are good for us, we want to hold on to those. But a lot of them have become deeply carved, routes down the mountain. And filling those in, burying them, and finding healthier ones is going to be an energy expending process. Okay? The effort will be harder in the beginning, and then as you create a new route down the mountain, you can condition yourself to having more favorable and constructive responses. That's the best way I can explain is why effort will lead to change, and your most effort will be spent in the beginning, and then you can change your emotional and cognitive responses by conditioning yourself to find a different route down the mountain.
You don't actively undo a habit. You create a new habit, and the old habit atrophies, and now it's trying to basically remap this new pattern. But in remapping, you're sort of breaking that old or not breaking it, but it's over time, it's just beginning to atrophy. I don't know a better way to say it.
Dendritic plasticity, neuronal plasticity at the cellular level is all about use it or lose it is a very old phrase, but it applies. If it's reaching out, looking for an electrical signal to come by and trigger it, shower it with some chemicals. After a while, if it's not bathed in what it wants, the brain will say, let those dendrites wither and morph and reach out to other tentacles. That's the cellular basis of steering electricity within your brain. That's the cellular basis for creating a new electrical groove down the mountain. You were born with more brain cells than as a kid than you are as an adult. And
because we're losing them slowly over time?
We're equipped with a lot that we can't hold on to. You're going to reinforce the ones that you're using, and the ones you don't use, your brain will say, I don't need to hold on to them because they're just using energy. But the plasticity is we start off with more brain cells than we hold on to, yet we get smarter than for the most part, when we are as kids. And we get more coordinated. As we lose brain cells, that's the example that shows you that it's about the connections and reinforcing those patterns. I hope that empowers people to be like, wait a second, it's not a static thing. And much I would exercise for my body, there are things maybe I should do for my brain and mind, especially while the window is still here. this plasticity we're talking about is highest in your teens. And that's actually when you get a lot of mental health disorders. It's a weird thing. The most dynamic shape shifting is in adolescence. So we come into our identity, but it's also a peak of mental health issues. So you're sort of setting your cognitive and emotional thermostat. And then 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, it does slow down, but it doesn't wither to zero. So you're basically, the electricity in the brain is shooting through hubs. So
Does this all come down to repetition?
well, I think right now, repetition can ingrain a physical habit. But what we're talking about, just to go backwards on this, is if you look at a snake and you've never seen one before, a lot of people reflexively jump back. And let's say it's a plastic snake. First time you might jump. Second time you say, well, I've seen that before. Your instinct was tamped down by your frontal lobes. And those structures are our emotional and instinctive responses to our environment. They should be malleable by our thought. The thought of these giant frontal lobes behind our forehead should say to them, you don't, just because you're angry doesn't mean you should physically reach out and hurt somebody. Just because you've seen a snake, you know it's plastic. You don't have to jump every time. Just because you're afraid of public speaking doesn't mean after a while you have to be afraid of it. So that it's not conditioning, it's a thought that tamps down instincts we feel are destructive or not useful. So when I see, going back to the electrical stimulation, when I grab a doorknob, sometimes I think, oh, I should wash my hands. But if I grab a doorknob and go wash my hands 80 times, the frontal lobe is having a hard time tamping down those emotional hubs. And we can drill a hole and put a catheter into these subcortical structures. They're like nodules within the web of neurons. And electrical tickling of that will snap the patient out of this obsessive compulsive disorder.
Does
Not
it
always.
last?
It lasts.
Get the fuck
Yeah.
out of here.
Deep brain stimulation. You'd love this topic, but depression, OCD, and obesity, the drive to eat, it can all be modulated, and they're all housed near each other. That speaks to what they are, is an imbalance of the emotional drive with the ability for the frontal lobes to tamp down some of these instincts. It's instinctive to eat. Sometimes it can feel instinctive to be depressed, and sometimes obsessive compulsion is a part of our brain, and it's a natural part of our brain. It's okay to have those feelings. When you have them too much, the imbalance isn't just electrochemical in those emotional hubs. It's the frontal lobes not accessing their potential to tamp down some of the emotions. Some people actually have aberrant, robust, lighting up of some of these structures. Amygdala ones people usually think of, but in these subcortical structures, some people, it actually correlates that they light up more and they have greater addiction in that group. So there's a structural element, there's a life context element, and then there's also the frontal lobe element, and that thinking of creating new habits, creating new values, creating less triggers in your life. That's the opportunity that we all have, and I think that's the project you're working on. What's the stuff we can control without zapping ourselves and without putting pills in us? Those things set the boundaries, but the frontal lobe regulation of how we feel is in your own command. And you've seen it in Buddhist monks. You've seen the mind-body connection in deep divers. There's actually two nerves that come down and wrap around the heart. They can think down their pulse. They can think down how fast their heart beats. This is not like baloney. This is, you can put an ultrasound, you can look it up online, you see videos of it. That shows that thinking can change, thought can change how fast your heart beats. Why wouldn't we believe that thought can change those subcortical structures about anxiety and depression? If you get depressed, you're sort of, you can get stuck. But people who aren't having those mental health issues, but just want to be better and live a more rich life in the sense of personal experience, we can think about our lives and our habits and triggers and create effects inside us. The mind-body connection is mind down to body. And many people feel, body back up to mind, and that's where meditation and meditative breathing come in. But those connections are real. You see examples around you. If your frontal lobe can only help you 5% and somebody else is all dialed in and helps them 50%, it doesn't matter. That's your best. And that's an avenue available to you. But it's not a simple one. It's not a quick fix. It's not going to be a bullet. It actually takes work. And you mentioned repetition. It takes work. It takes effort. And there is no shortcut to it, but it's a glacial change that can happen over a few months to a few years. And I think once, like people go to the gym, they can't not go to the gym anymore. I think people who find these rituals and habits that make them feel better, they become addictive to that, and they're constructive and they're not pharmacologic. The conclusion is anything difficult where you have to think is good for your brain. If you ask Usain Bolt, how do I get stronger legs? Run. It's intuitive. But the flesh in our skulls, it's meant to think and feel. And that is the power of self-growth. And it's a thinking machine. It's a thinking flesh that you actually have to use or to protect itself, because it's an energy hog, right? It's 3 pounds, but uses 20%. If you're not using parts of it, it'll program itself to let those parts of the garden wither. So the diversity of thinking and the depth of thinking, just one level past what you're used to, is the way to keep the whole garden flourishing. And it is a garden in there. There's chemicals, there are things moving, there are different types of brain cells. It's not just neurons. So I always try to give that metaphor analogy, if you will, that it's a garden and you have to irrigate it and stimulate and tend to all the corners, particularly the ones you're starting to neglect. Maybe it's your left hand. Getting out of the box and engaging the recesses of your mind is the most important thing. And then you have then the creative things happen. You don't just sit down and have them happen. You got to work and dream and go hard, and on top of that, something creative can happen.